talk is, I'm just going to sit here. It's kind of a lunch talk. So, but it's going to be a little bit different from the other ones in terms of I'm going to discuss some of the things I'm doing instead of studying innovation or healthcare innovation, we're actually executing on some of it with some companies involved trying to launch new initiatives. But it kind of falls into the category Casey mentioned before, which is that we spend very little time worrying about the supply side relative to how financing is done. And if you look at health economics in general, a lot of it is about who pays and how much, as opposed to how can we stimulate essentially new innovation, which ultimately is the thing I think that I haven't measured it, but my guess would be a priori that's really what matters in terms of improving health for people, that kind of innovation. So many times what's good for financing purposes are not necessarily good for innovation purposes. And that clash is many times not recognized, I think, in health economics. So innovation essentially always, and the things I'm going to talk about today as well, you can think of always sort of lowering costs and make health cheaper that otherwise was more expensive. So when you hear people saying that brand name drugs, brand name drugs are actually cutting prices more than generics are, because brand name drugs make the health enabled by that drug essentially cheaper many times more than generics lowering the price of the drug. So if you think of my favorite example would be HIV. You couldn't buy a longer life anywhere on the planet if you were HIV positive in 1995, but then the new innovations came on the market and you could purchase that longer life with the brand name innovations. So innovation in disguise many times is cost reducing, even though it might increase healthcare spending. And certainly there's a lot of evidence in the health economics literature that innovation is the source of a lot of healthcare spending growth. But for the price of health, essentially, it's always reducing the cost of better health. Now, I'm going to talk about two efforts I've been involved with, which deals with AI innovation, artificial intelligence, which is also just another way of lowering costs by raising productivity, essentially. And so this is not a discussion about how to study AI innovation, essentially. Just going to talk about how has this been executed in two areas that I've been involved with as a product developer, essentially. And it might suggest certain research around that, which I think would be very interesting to do. So the first area concerns a new product that's going to ensure clinical trials. So clinical trials is about 2/3 of health or medical R&D spending. It's phase 1, 2, 3 for drugs. And it's a big component of that spending. And I've developed a product for Lloyd's of London, which is the world's largest insurance conglomerate. And they will now launch a product this month that will ensure the clinical trial cost if the trial fails in its endpoints. So you have a breast cancer drug, let's say, and you spend $10 million on the trial, and then it turns out there's no longevity effects compared to the treatment group, and then you get your $10 million back from Lloyd's if that turns out the case. So this is an insurance of a biological risk, and this is very important because that's something that insurers, it's a very good risk for insurers to insure. It's a biological risk, but it's just telling you how the molecule basically responds in the body. We're not insuring business expenses or anything like that, or management issues. We're just ensuring the outcome of the trial, whether it means it's endpoints or not. And it's a good risk to insure because it is completely uncorrelated whether we have a recession in the economy, et cetera. So it's, a beta zero, if you want to think of it that way. So the rest of their balance sheet is not correlated with this coverage, essentially. It's also good because within a portfolio of insured drugs, one drug failing doesn't determine or influence whether, a cancer drug failing doesn't influence whether the Alzheimer's drug is failing. So it's independence within the portfolio, which is very attractive for insurers as well, as opposed to, let's say, if you have a loan portfolio and you have a recession and everyone starts defaulting at the same time, that's a correlated claim in the insurance. Here you have uncorrelated claims when you have separate biological risks being insured. So how would this work? Well, suppose you have a biotech, like I said, that has a $10 million clinical trial it wants to run, and it takes out insurance. Now, these trials have high failure rates, right? So that's got to be reflected in the premium. So let's say this drug class has a 40% failure rate, in the sense that 40% of trials entered into don't meet their endpoints or have a successful outcome on their endpoint. So for that purpose, let's say the premium is $5 million to insure a $10 million trial. The reason that's valuable, there's sort of, if you just think of that straight insurance, and I'll talk a little bit about how you can finance around that. But now you can essentially, this is very attractive to philanthropic funders of medical or product development or drug development, such as American Cancer Society or similar institutions like that, because they can now, instead of funding a trial for $10 million, they can buy insurance on 2 trials for $10 million. Remember, the premium was $5 million, and therefore launch 2 efforts as opposed to 1, because once the drug company is covered in the insurance, they can go to their investors and say, I have a premium on the failure of this, or I have an insurance on the failure of this trial. If you invest in me, you're going to get your money back when the trial fails, and you get your upside when the trial succeeds. That's very attractive, much more attractive for investors than at 40% of losing all their money if the trial fails. So the disease groups are very interested in this kind of coverage, because it increases their kind of bang for the buck in getting medical innovation done in some sense. So this is, in some sense, this is, financial innovation to stimulate medical innovation, and disease groups are front and center, I think, in terms of using that type of insurance to get more activity on their funding drug development. But even without a disease group, suppose you are a biotech and you're trying to raise money for a $10 million trial, you can now go to your investors and say, I'm going to raise $15 million instead, but once I fail, you're going to get 2/3 of your money back, because the trial costs are insured, the $10 million. So invest in me, because you have some downward protection in your investment when the trial fails, essentially. And that's going to be an easier raise for the biotechs if they're covered. At least that's what they're telling us. We'll see when it launches. So that's the straight insurance, just the straight insurance on the trial itself. So, and Lloyd's have committed about $1 billion to cover, in coverage for that kind of clinical trial insurance. Another big US PE firm, private equity firm, has committed $1 billion to lend against that insurance, meaning, okay, you have an insurance on your trial, we're now offering you a loan, so you have a $10 million trial, we're going to lend you $10 million. If your trial fails, Lloyd's is going to pay us back because you're insured. So the loan is secured essentially with the insurance in that case. And we're going to charge you, for a loan that's secured a lot less than for a loan that's unsecured essentially. So there's a big value of having debt financing for these. These biotechs are usually very scared of debt financing, because once you have debt, you're going to go bankrupt if the trial fails. So you have no money and you have a debt, and that's the end of story. You're going to close your shop. So this allows them to be basically forgiven for their debt once the trial fails. It's going to cost them, obviously, but they're going to be forgiven for their debt. And then they have less dilution when they do well, meaning they're not holding equity. They didn't give up as much equity that the funders, typically the VCs, take a big share of their company, up to 60 to 70%. to fund their trials, and they avoid giving up all that, the whole store, by having debt as opposed to equity. So that's so this product, we basically, the insurance will be basically lending itself to a debt forgiveness instrument, if you want, by the lender. And that is also sort of part. The first part was just straight insurance. This is kind of a secure debt related product that will also potentially help biotechs keep control of their company. Now, how does AI? I said I was going to talk about AI. There's a company called ECCHC that I'm also involved with. ECCHC is the 4 letters in the DNA, and they're a California-based company that's going to underwrite this product for Lloyd's, essentially, meaning determine the risk. What is the risk of this trial actually failing or succeeding? And they have the market-leading technology, essentially, on predicting whether molecules are going to work on a particular drug target. So that AI is essentially enabling this financial innovation to take place, because without that AI, it would be not enough margin for Lloyd's to issue this coverage, essentially. That's how they make their margin, because the AI is better than the average risk in the class of predicting failure. Now, the question for a group like us, or, for a research group would be, which would be interesting to address, is, how much, if at all, would this stimulate medical innovation if you had insurance against biological failure in that innovation process? That's something, you could probably get funding from Lloyd's to do, essentially, to figure out. But it is an important component because, ultimately this financial innovation, like I said, is built to deliver more medical innovation. And the question is that true? And to what degree can that take place when you have this insurance? So I think that's kind of illustrates, a real world product that kind of came. I've actually proposed this product a long time ago, 2015. And then I got sidetracked with other work. But it is a real product that I think, comes out of economics training and thinking a little bit more about the supply side rather than just the payment side in some sense. So that's one set of how AI is essentially enabling new financial markets currently through the ECCHC underwriting, which is instrumental for this product to essentially be launched. We couldn't do it before. The second product is a little bit less complex, which is, this is a company called iRemedy, and it's one of the architects of Amazon Marketplace is now going into the medical supply space, and he has designed essentially a platform whereby which manufacturers of medical products, whether it's drugs, devices, or what have you, can essentially interact directly with providers, hospitals, and doctors, essentially, without a middleman. So that's kind of what Amazon does in the first place. They cut out the retailer. So here the effort is to do that in the medical supply chain. And who are the middlemen, as well as the giants like McKesson and Cardinal and those guys, who are essentially the middlemen in the medical supply chain. By the way, McKesson's CEO is a Ph.D. econ student here at University of Chicago, Brian Tyler, who was in the same cohort as Casey and me back in the days. So he's pretty old, as you can tell. But he's an interesting guy. So the iRemedy's purpose is to make Brian Tyler lose his job, essentially. But that's the goal. That is to essentially the goal to have one less step in the medical supply chain, essentially. And I'll talk a little bit about one of the main efforts, which is to help, trying to help. We're in discussion with Lilly on their obesity drug, which was mentioned here in an earlier talk. Obesity drugs, I'll do a little side show on obesity drug because the co-author Richard Posner and I predicted about 25 years ago that sooner or later medical innovation in obesity will be far more successful than so-called preventable behavior or diet and exercise in reducing obesity. And it's actually and it will be innovation. We predicted if this drug comes to market, is by far the largest drug, and it is now by far the largest drug we've seen. And the reason is because the prevalence of the disease is so high. So it's a huge market. It's a huge incentive to innovate. Therefore, people have tried for a long time, but now finally we're getting treatments that are working. But obesity is kind of like many other diseases where we think that if we just had the right behavior, we could sort of solve this problem or reduce the prevalence and incidence of the disease. And it's so cheap to do that we shouldn't need to take pills or whatever if we just behaved correctly. But it's very costly for people to change their behavior, it appears. That's why we have an obesity epidemic, essentially. But it's true for many other diseases. HIV is the same thing. So if you believe biologists, they think we're here to do two things. One is eat, and then two is to spread our genes through sex. So HIV is the sex component, obesity is the eating component. It's very hard to change those behaviors. It's very inelastic, if you want. And medical innovation has by far been cheaper than behavioral change in limiting the impact of those types of diseases. The primary example for that is, I think, COVID. COVID could also be prevented if we just all sat at home. It's very costly. The economy took huge hits in foregone economic activity when we did that. So behaviorally, it can be prevented in principle. It's very, very costly. Compare that to the maybe a few tens of billions spent on medical innovation that generated vaccine and therapeutics. And that's a much cheaper form of prevention through innovation rather than behavioral change or lack of face-to-face interaction. So that's kind of the poster drug or poster case for why innovation is many times more often cheaper than behavioral change in actually limiting disease. So Eli Lilly has, these drugs are now enormous as predicted. There's these are huge markets given the prevalence. Novo Nordisk in Denmark has a market cap of 555 billion. Compare that to Denmark's GDP, which is about 400 billion. Essentially, one is a wealth measure or present value of future income as opposed to GDP, which is a flow measure, but to give you some indication of the size of these drugs. Lilly has a market cap of 725 billion, enormous. Compare that to Pfizer's, who at the peak of COVID, when they had the best vaccine and the best treatment, had a market cap of 325 billion. So these are enormous drugs because of the prevalence of the diseases. And what iRemedy is trying to accomplish is to have a direct distribution. Lilly has actually set up a direct distribution already. It's called Lilly Direct, very indicative name. And by which you basically go through telemedicine to get access to these obesity drugs as opposed to go to your own doctor. So you basically log in on Lilly's webpage, and then you get assigned to a telemedicine office that can basically have a doctor talk to you. And then you can get prescribed that way to cut if you want, the intermediary steps between manufacturers and patients through telemedicine. They're essentially limiting that cost. A lot of the cost of obtaining a drug, many times it's not necessarily the dollar cost, it's time cost involved in going, seeing a doctor, etc. And not only Lilly, but Pfizer and other companies are very interested in using mechanism to go directly to the patients as opposed to, or more easily go to the patients than, physical meetings with doctors, etc. So I remedy this AI, so that sort of, if you think of it as the Amazon marketplace for medical products, is very involved to try to help Eli Lilly do that. The research here, I think, is more about thinking about how direct distribution of medical products directly from manufacturers to patients can impact, the value in health generated from that. Given that a lot of times the cost of healthcare is not dollars, but time, how much are you generating in better health by having sort of lowering the time cost of care, if you want, from these direct distribution systems that are going to be put up through the AI. I think that's something that I don't know if we have studies on time costs on, adherence and initiation of certain drugs, etc. I think those studies exist there, but I don't know if we have studies on sort of in the general distribution scheme, if you get access in your home as opposed to traveling to see a doctor, how much impact there are studies of travel distance in healthcare, how much that lowers utilization. So if you can electronically travel to your doctor as opposed to physically travel to your doctor, that is certainly going to be, according to that evidence base, it's going to be important to improve your health. So that gives you two examples of sort of companies who are in the middle of this in terms of using innovation to improve healthcare. And I'll be happy to take any questions about it or talk around it, what you think are useful sort of research questions raised by this. And because I think AI is going to have an enormous impact both on medical innovation, not necessarily through this insurance, but in general, because we're getting much better in predicting drugs without doing clinical trials, essentially. And the huge cost of developing drugs is the failure rate and time involved in very costly testing of drugs. And also in the supply chain, I think AI is going to have an enormous impact on lowering the cost of sort of accessing healthcare, not necessarily through a high remedy, but in that space, that's going to be an important component, and we already seen it. It's sort of weird. We needed it in some sense for telemedicine. We needed a big pandemic to tell us how valuable it was, but I think now people are understanding that it went well beyond, infectious disease to realize the value of having less time-consuming if you want healthcare. So I'll open up the floor to any questions or suggestions.
Just a question about what you presented. iRemedy, they're distributing. What does AI have to do with that?
So it's the AI platform. So if you look at Amazon Marketplace, there's a ton of AI. I'm not an AI expert, obviously, but there's a ton of AI that goes into matching customers to manufacturers and getting that distribution, or getting a catalog of thousands of things to actually work in terms of sending stuff. And that's the same with if you have medical products on one, or you have manufacturers. It's not different. It's just medical, that you have the Pfizers or the medical device companies on over here, and you're trying to reach a customer over here. There's a lot of stuff that if you did it manually, it would just completely break down. You couldn't coordinate it manually.
So it's an upgraded search engine.
I don't know what you want to call it, but you can't do it manually because the time involved. I mean, you could do it manually, but it would take, it wouldn't be so beneficial because it'd take forever to set up every crate if you want. So it's all, in fact, iRemedy is developing agents like customer service operators that are AI, not people. who will then ask you, certain questions and then feed it back to the patient, et cetera. So this whole coordination problem wouldn't be feasible with just people involved sitting in a, warehouse. It has to be automated.
So I think probably, yeah, so Professor Philipson mentioned that the cost of clinical trials is like 2/3 of all the innovation. So maybe we can think about to use can we use the existing clinical trial data to like help us to like refine AI models to to build on the existing clinical trial data of other drugs to help us to develop or like innovate like new
What
drugs.
they do, they train the AI on past clinical trial data a lot, but the whole purpose here is to basically not have a huge year-long or many year-long process by which you essentially find a drug. So the AI can find a drug. In fact, this ECCHC company I mentioned, they have developed their own drugs with the AI. Say, here's the molecule we develop, it's going to be working, and now they're going into animals. It's working exactly as predicted. That doesn't translate into humans yet, but it's amazing that they can predict in the animals. And this is not coming through any kind of petri dishes at the lab. It's just coming off the computer that they developed that molecule, essentially. So therefore, they can do this much quicker. They can develop 10 drugs a year this way, right? Easily, as opposed to that would take an enormous amount of time to do without AI development. So they're not alone in this space. There's a lot of people, not a lot, but there's like 5 firms that are sort of leading in this space, roughly. But you're going to see that they not only do they predict whether a given molecule is going to work, they're also developing new molecules off the AI, which is going to speed up the whole process.
So you use the AlphaFold, like the AlphaFold of
what?
So we have like AlphaFold. Is that like that? Some chemical molecules. So they are searching for some
I didn't
called
understand.
AlphaFold.
I didn't understand the word.
Yeah. So that.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think
See that this, demonstrates that I don't know enough about AI, but I just know the result.
Okay.
The key is the result here. So here's the result that hooked me on it. They had UC Irvine chemistry department send them blind molecules and say, does this work or not? And then they had the AI run it. And they were right 80% of the time. Now compare that to drug development, where a given drug class in phase 1, 2, 3 fails 50% of the time. So you're wrong 50% of the time. Here they were wrong 20% of the time. That's a huge leap in performance in terms of reducing the cost and resources spent in trying to get drugs developed.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. So normally clinical trials will take like 10, 15 years to complete and sometimes more based on the evidence from ECCHC. How shortened can we complete
You still
those?
have to do the trials. That's the thing, right? So,
Okay.
But this will increase the success rate. So if you look at success rates now, phase 1 is about, I think it's like 60% of drugs go on to phase 2, and then it's like down to 40 or 30% from phase 2 to 3. And then it's another 25% or something that actually makes it to approval to FDA. So from start to finish, it's about an 88% failure rate, essentially, which is massive, right? So that what you're trying to do is to reduce that failure rate from what's called an initial new drug application, which is before phase 1, until going to market, to reduce that failure. You still have to show to FDA that this works in humans, right? You're not going to be able to sidestep FDA because you're doing that. So you still have to demonstrate that it works, but the name of the game here is to not the reason you hear this estimate that it costs $2.5 billion to develop a drug, that's not for each successful drug that reaches the market. That's taking account all the spending on the, 88% of drugs who didn't make the market. So for each successful drug, you spend $2.5 billion, but that includes all the failures to get one successful drug, essentially, right? So if you look at a clinical development program for a drug, it might be 100 million or whatever. But you failed, 88% of the time with that. So essentially, that's what's attempted to get reduced, and also to get the new molecule quicker. There's a long time before you actually have a molecule, before you even start in animals. But what this effort is involved in is trying to get that much quicker done. So you can start animal testing.
So, I have a fair amount of questions. First, so why the insurance market for the same people
Hey, what?
for the insurance market for the R&D, it was not there before?
Correct.
But people don't assess the rate of the.
Well, but that's true of any insurance market that you don't know. That's the whole thing you're trying to insure. Like, so you buy car insurance, you don't know whether you're going to crash or not, right? So the whole purpose of an insurance is to kind of limit your downside when something bad happens, and we take a haircut, the premium on you when it doesn't happen in some sense. So that's the same here, essentially, that an accident for a clinical trial is a failed trial, and you're going to take a haircut when the trial goes well, meaning you pay the premium for this, but now your company is worth, 10x what it was before this successful trial. So it's, you take a little bit off the top to make sure you don't lose all the money on the downside.
Yeah, so I think so the risk is there, and I think it makes sense that the company should do that before. But the market was not there before, so why the people think about get the rate of failure of the child, or?
It might be the underwriting, because, if the insurance company is going to charge you a margin on the risk on 50%, it becomes, 60, 70%. That's 7 cents on the dollar, or 70 cents on the dollar. So it might be that the underwriting is what made sort of this fly in some sense, because once the underwriting and you're putting down the risk to 20% when you insure a trial, you can deal with that.
But I think he's asking what's new. This failed the market test all the way up through 2024.
Which failed market. I don't think people have tried it.
These products, he says these products haven't been around until,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been telling Tom the story about Milton Friedman thought there should be trade in CPI futures. And they went to the Merck and they started a pit and nobody wanted to trade it and it had to close.
Yeah, I mean, we have a market, so it might not be demand, certainly, But as far as anyone in this industry, I don't think they would have brought up, we tried this before, and they haven't. But like with any new product, you don't know if it's going to work until it's, until people start buying it.
Yeah.
There's new insurance product launched every year. So does that negate that? I mean, innovation is innovation, right? So question is, when you have new products, does that mean the market did something wrong before you had a new product? Not necessarily. This is just financial innovation, as opposed to, you could say, why wasn't there a drug to cure obesity 30 years ago? People were fat 30 years ago. Right? So if you bring a new drug to the market, it's because of the innovation. I think there's a lot of innovation in this financial product that couldn't been done without, I think, the AI.
So that's where AI comes in. Without AI, people cannot do that, because they cannot assess the risk.
It helps with the underwriting, right? It
Yeah,
helps with the
it helps.
underwriting, yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Hi.
Hi.
So for a lot of like diseases like Parkinson's, cancers, there are tons of clinical trials and they can train models on these, right? But for rare diseases, right, where you don't have lots of clinical trials, for you to train on, because
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. You
Yeah.
trade, I mean, it turns out half of the FDA pipeline is cancer, actually. And people are very interested in that. I mean, it's obviously a huge, I think it's the second biggest killer or something like that, but it's also because cancer therapies is mostly in the old population in Medicare, and Medicare pays very strangely for physician administrated drug, which many cancer therapies like chemotherapy, et cetera, are. Because they pay, as you know, probably that they pay a certain percentage of the drug cost gets paid to the doctor for administrating the drug. So, you know, it used to be 6% or whatever. So if you have $1,000 drug, the doctor gets more. 6% of 1,000 is a lot more than 6% of 100. So there's a very perverse incentive in Medicare Part B drug sales, or physician administrated drug sales, if you want. So that's an issue, and that's where most of the cancer population sits in the 65 plus. So a lot of what FDA is seeing is oncology development, both because it's an important disease, but also because it's physician administrated, and you basically have a customer who likes higher prices. Very few markets are like that. And that's kind of a screwed up government way of doing things, but that's the current state we're at. Essentially, the doctor wants a higher price drug because 6% on a high price drug is more than 6% on a low price drug. So, but you're right, coming to rare diseases, then you have less data to train on. So the AI is definitely better on cancer than on rare diseases. Any other questions?
There's a question in the chat online. David, if you want to unmute yourself. Or I can read it as well. Is anyone researching the barriers to implementing AI innovations? It will be seen as a threat to physician income in primary care, radiology, pathology, dermatology, and other physician activities where reimbursement can be affected. For example, it has taken decades to change medical practice acts to allow nurse practitioners to enter the direct care market. What can academia do through its research to facilitate more rapid achievement of AI benefits?
So I think Grogan's gonna deal with policy towards, if I don't.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's a great,
That's a great lead into to Joe
Right.
Grogan.